Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Dr. Adrian Cable, Vice President of Research and Development at LifeSize, and you're watching episode 6 of my weekly series on advanced collaboration. And for those of you that have missed earlier episodes, what is advanced collaboration? Well, it's how we go beyond just video and voice, integrating content, whiteboarding, improving productivity wherever you choose to collaborate, whether that's in a physical office or increasingly now in a post-pandemic world, in a home office or on the road. And this week, we're staying on our narrative arc of what we call hybrid work, how to work productively wherever you are. But we're changing direction a little bit into the very important topic of information security and what that really means for the hybrid worker today and into the future. So before the pandemic, most white-collar workers spent their times in offices where their employers managed information security on their behalf. You probably never realized how much was going on behind the scenes to make sure that confidential material you created or had access to never left the organization. And your company probably had many of these things set up in your office that worked in the background, probably without you even knowing. VLAN, VPNs, firewall, enterprise-grade routers, enterprise-grade switches, internal secure network storage, and a company-wide app policy that was pretty well enforced. For example, everybody uses Slack for instant messaging. Everybody uses LifeSize or Zoom for video. So because this is something that a lot of people never really used to think about, let's spend a moment going through each of those and why they're important. First of all, VLANs. The point of VLANs is to secure devices from each other that otherwise would be on the same physical network. For example, in an office, you generally want to isolate more sensitive devices from everyday users, so that some hack on somebody's cell phone, for example, that may be on the corporate network, can't then cause a security breach on confidential information that's stored on servers elsewhere. So most large organizations divide up their networks into different security domains, and that all happens in the background. Most of the time, you're not even aware that anything is going on. Enterprise-grade routers with a firewall set up correctly. Again, generally, enterprise routers configured in such a way or configurable in such a way to filter certain traffic, particularly disallowing all incoming connections, which is essential for security. Kind of applications that generally require incoming connections, things like gaming, are not things that need to be supported in an office typically, so that's relatively easy to manage. Secure internal network storage. Not just security is important here, but also automatic backup, because the cost to an organization if data is lost due to some equipment failure is very high. And again, that usually just worked in the background without anyone knowing. Although now, of course, a lot of internal storage for backup is giving way in many organizations to cloud storage. And also a company-wide enforced app policy. So that everybody uses the same tools for instant messaging, everybody uses the same tools for video. And this is really important for two reasons. One is for security, because IT supporting a vast array of potentially unknown apps is very difficult. It's very difficult to manage that, but also for workplace cohesion. If everybody in your office uses their own favorite tool for instant messaging, it becomes very hard to communicate with people. And most of those things are kind of so obvious that you never really had to think about them, and you certainly never had to be involved in managing them or enforcing them. Then the pandemic hit, and your spare bedroom or garage became your new daily office. And this is not a great environment for work for many reasons. There's high levels of noise very often in the home, high levels of distraction, ergonomics issues, lighting issues. We covered many of these in our episode last week on how to manage distractions in the home. But what many people didn't think about at the time is that now you're working from home, you're your own CIO and CSO and head of IT. Why? Because all the IT infrastructure that used to be managed by your company is now physically located in your home. And moreover, it probably wasn't designed for office work or for sensitive business communications and data. So, what are the differences between your home and your office in terms of the data environment? The internet is just the internet, right? Well, not really. First of all, in your home, there's likely no VLAN or anything similar set up to isolate your network from the outside world. So, whereas in an office, subnets and network segments are set up very carefully so that devices that don't need to communicate with each other are physically blocked from doing so in case one of them is compromised. In the home, there's almost never anything like that set up. Any device on your home network can communicate with any other device on your home network. And in today's IoT world, there are now an average of 50 connected devices on typical home networks. Pretty much every electronic device you now own has some kind of radio that communicates via Wi-Fi, in addition to all your personal electronics devices, your computers, Internet of Things, appliances. And because there's no isolation between any device on your network and any other device, any kind of security compromise on one of those devices can potentially put your whole network at risk. So in addition, you probably have a router that's either not set up right, in the sense that potentially it allows incoming connections when you don't really need that, or it may be very old, or it may have out-of-date firmware that has security vulnerabilities that were never patched because most people in the home don't care, or because it requires manual firmware updates to be provided by your internet provider, which you never asked for and never applied. You may even have a Wi-Fi network with a potentially insecure password. You might even have a guest network with a default password that came pre-configured on the router, which you've forgotten about or maybe even never knew about. And at the very least, you almost certainly have only WPA2 personal security on your Wi-Fi network, which is protected by a single password, which is subject to brute force attacks, versus what you have in the workplace, which is usually WPA2 Enterprise that has a dedicated authentication server based on Radius or other technologies that's much less vulnerable to that sort of thing. So all of these differences cause a lot of problems because there are now lots of ways for outsiders to gain access to your data compared with how things were in an office. And I need to amplify this. The attack surface in the home is very large. You're susceptible to drive-by attacks due to Wi-Fi password cracking, as somebody can literally sit outside your house and try connecting to your network over and over and over again, searching through passwords. This sort of thing just isn't possible with corporate Wi-Fi networks. And the main risk here is essentially security vulnerabilities or backdoors into the apps that you have installed on your personal devices. Most of us have hundreds and hundreds of apps installed on our personal devices. Many of them are unvetted. You have no idea what kinds of weaknesses they have. And the central problem here is not so much malice, but software defects that lead to vulnerabilities. And I'll give Zoom as a good example here. So people probably recall the Zoom scandal April last year, when it was found that Zoom's installer, in order to present a faster installation experience, basically collected your root password from your system and then used that to make changes at once, make a number of changes at once to your system, rather than the normal Mac method of delegating making admin level changes to the system, which requires a number of different prompts to be accepted. So this was done as a convenience feature. And the issue was that the app that was part of the installer that did this had a vulnerability which could then be exploited by other apps on your system to escalate privileges. So, for example, to access your microphone and your camera without your permission once you'd granted Zoom those privileges. Now, this problem was found and patched before any exploits were known in the wild, but it does highlight the problem that if a $30 billion at the time company can produce an app with vulnerabilities like this? What do you know about the hundreds of other apps that you have on your system and what they could allow an attacker to do if they're compromised due to bugs? So even if you don't care about the security of your employer's data, although you really should, the fact that attackers now have a much stronger incentive to target you also puts your other home data at risk. Right? Before, it probably wasn't worth attackers going to quite considerable effort to target your home network when all they could really get is the login to your Instagram account. But now, potentially, your home network is used 24/7 for exchanging confidential corporate information. The stakes are a lot higher. And hopefully that gives you a reason to be concerned. So, so again, most of the time here, and this is very important, the issue is not one of malice, it's one of bugs in software. And it's especially true if your apps don't get updated regularly. So that's also something important to check, that apps are updated regularly. It's also worth focusing on things that don't really matter so much. So there's a lot of buzz about end-to-end encryption for video communications, and a lot of people throw the term around without really understanding what it means. So I'll explain. Generally, when data flows across the internet, it travels through a variety of different computers on the way from source to destination. There may be data centers, there may be routing centers, they may be nodes in your internet provider, other internet providers. And generally, data is encrypted between each of the hops. But at each of those nodes, it's essentially decrypted and then re-encrypted before passing it on. End-to-end encryption works differently. With end-to-end encryption, data is encrypted at the start, which is maybe your computer, and is decrypted at the other end, so the other person that you're communicating with, and it remains encrypted for the entire journey. And the theoretical advantage of that is that nobody in the middle can intercept your communications because the data is encrypted at that point. Whereas without end-to-end encryption, a bad actor sitting in Zoom's data center, for example, could potentially eavesdrop on communications that you're having. So clearly, end-to-end encryption sounds like a good thing, and a lot of vendors are moving in that direction. But it's worth saying that if you speak to law enforcement, for example, they really don't care about end-to-end encryption for video communications and voice communications, making intercepts difficult, because there are so many other ways to intercept video and voice. Given that we all have computers with microphones and cameras, it's usually much easier to use an exploit in some other app to install some kind of malware on your computer to capture keystrokes, listen to your microphone, record your camera, do a conventional wiretap to listen in on phone lines. All of those things are much easier than decrypting data by intercepting it as it flows through data centers around the world. So end-to-end encryption is clearly a good thing, but don't rely on it to keep your communications secure. It's much more important to make sure that your computers and other devices that you use are basically clean. So what do we mean by that? Well, here are things that you can do. First of all, if your router is more than 2 years old, get an upgrade. And usually, router upgrades are free from your internet provider, so just call them up and ask. Or invest in a third-party router with a proven security record, like Eero or Google Wi-Fi, or the devices from Ubiquiti. There are many good choices. And unlike routers provided by internet providers, most third-party devices are set up safe by default. In other words, they block incoming connections, they don't have guest networks active. So just doing that switch can be an important upgrade for your home security. Now, if that's not an option for you, review your router settings. Make sure firewalls are enabled. Make sure incoming connections are disabled. Generally, you can do this without causing any issues. Now, some services, as I mentioned, like gaming, for example, very often require incoming connections. If you don't use any of those services, you can just block everything, and that makes your network much safer without causing any issues. But if you do use services that require incoming connections, they will usually tell you. They'll give you specific IP addresses to whitelist, and you can add those to your router settings and continue to use those services without compromising security elsewhere. Next, every 3 to 6 months or so, commit to doing an app house clean on all the devices that you own. Uninstall all apps that you don't regularly use from any network-connected devices in your home. So not just your iPhones and your computers, but also devices like Apple TV that also have apps installed. And disconnect any network devices you don't regularly use. A lot of people have home automation hubs and that kind of device lying around even when they don't actually use the device they're paired with anymore. So make sure that everything that's connected to your network are things that you actively use and actively keep up to date. And finally, and maybe most importantly, on your computing devices, try to consolidate to the minimum number of apps required for a specific function. So, for example, most people have multiple video conference tools. Do you really need them? And maybe it's time to ask Uncle Bob, who's retired and has less to be concerned about regarding security than you do, to switch to a more mainstream tool like Lifesize or Teams, which has proven security, instead of you having to use some random, unvetted instant messaging app, which your Uncle Bob asks you to download to keep in touch. So what happens next? Well, eventually many of us will go back to the office, and then there is a big problem because everybody will re-import a year or 18 months worth of these accumulated potential issues and app fragmentation back into the office and back onto the corporate network. And I'm sure that pretty much all of us will admit to having installed multiple instant messaging clients, multiple meeting apps, multiple file storage apps over the last year or so, when you basically now have full control over the apps that live on your devices, rather than that being managed actively by IT in your office. And this will cause a major headache for the actual CIOs and CSOs and heads of IT in your organization, and hence for you as well, unless you do your part to simplify your IT life first before you go back to the office. So get ahead of the curve. So finally, we're just going to wrap with a couple of security fails to end the session this week. So here is a not particularly effective security dog in the background. This is an example actually in an office of a network attached storage device with a root password written on a sticker on it. Best avoid that. This is great home security. We've all left our key under the doormat. If you do that, make sure you can't see the key through the mat. That's really not a good idea. And finally, the password change sign-up sheet. This was in a school, and this is real, believe it or not. If you can avoid those things, you'll be better than many others. So next week, we're going to continue on the security theme by bringing in a couple of special guests to talk about their own experiences with managing security in a hybrid work world. And we're also going to be expanding the format of these weekly talks. So if you have any thoughts about hybrid work or advanced collaboration, and you want to be a guest on a future episode of Advancing Collaboration with Dr. Adrian Cable, reach out to us on our LinkedIn page or our YouTube channel. Hope you've enjoyed this week. See you next Thursday.